Welcome to Chew the Fat. In this series, I sit down with high-performance guests and we talk about life, business, and what it takes to be at the top. This is part of my mission to raise $1 million for charity by writing a cookbook called Eat with Purpose. But I'm going to need your help. If you can share the content and leave a review, it's going to make a massive impact. And the bigger the audience, the greater the reach, and the sooner we can get to that $1 million goal. Enjoy the episode. Well, Tracey, this fine afternoon we have a little red curry here with chicken, sweet potato, and on top a little bit of yogurt. And this is to tie it into the mission to raise $1 million for charity by writing a cookbook. So let's get stuck in.
This looks delicious. The presentation is beautiful.
Love that.
And I'm sure it tastes just as good too. I love a red curry.
Oh, hello. A little bit of spice there.
Oh, they're really delicate flavours too.
Tracey Spicer, award-winning journalist and author. Welcome to Chew the Fat.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast and for that beautiful lunch.
I'm glad you liked it. So where I'd love to start is contextual background. What was it in your childhood that created the person you are today?
I was really fortunate to have two wonderful parents. We didn't have much money, but my sister and I were taught from a young age that we could do anything. If we worked hard, we created our own opportunities. And I think that's a gift for life, having that work ethic. We were also fortunate that my mum was the really strong one around the house and Dad was the more passive, sensitive, beautiful soul. If my sister or I fell over and needed a Band-Aid on our knee, we'd run to Dad, not Mum, because Mum would say, bloody well, get up and get on with it. So it was really nice to see two people who broke down those gender stereotypes, I guess, of the 1960s and 70s.
That's cool. And what, of that upbringing, like what are the key, I guess, lessons that you learned, you think that like got you to become, you know, so big in the journalist space?
Part of it was the area that I grew up in. It was a really low socioeconomic area on the outskirts of Brisbane called Redcliffe, aka Deadcliffe. And even though we had a safe household with beautiful, loving parents, it was a pretty violent area. There was a very high crime rate, huge issues with poverty, and a lot of things to do with equity, you know, people losing their jobs, not getting opportunities. So I learnt from a really young age that I was very passionate about trying to give people a leg up and an opportunity if something had happened to them, if they'd had an injury or lost their job. I became really passionate about what happens to people if they fall off life's hamster wheel, who helps them up? And that, I guess, set a fire in my belly for social justice that really burns to this day.
So give me, like, contextualise that for me. Like, what age bracket were you and give me an example of when that popped up.
We lived in Redcliffe from when I was about 10 to 21, really formative years. And you would see a lot of drug use, a lot of violence in the streets. You sort of learnt that life was not always terrific for people. There was an awful lot of poverty. You'd go around to other people's places and realise that they were having a piece of toast or baked beans for dinner, and that was it because they couldn't afford to have vegetables. I get a little bit frustrated these days when people say, oh, why can't they just go out and buy vegetables or go for a walk? But if you grow up in a really, really poor area, you think, well, this is the way life is and I can't get out of that. I guess that combined with Mum and Dad's really hard work ethic that was taught to my sister and I created a passion in both of us to try to get out of that area and make something of ourselves in life, but also when we do that to try to help others as well.
And bring me into the I guess the first stepping stones of then how you then went into the journalist world.
Oh gosh, I did a journalism degree, first person in my family to do so, and that was very lucky because it was at a time when the university was free, because I came from the kind of family where if we had to pay for it, I never would have gone to uni. So that was wonderful and very fortuitous. However, when I finished uni, it happened at the time of the Black October stock market crash of 1987, which a lot of people have forgotten about now, back in the days of perms and panel vans, and I couldn't get a job for 6 months in journalism. I had to do a series of crazy jobs, working in a shoe store, tutoring Indigenous kids in maths, which I loved, singing in the Queen Street Mall. I'm a terrible singer, but I busked to make ends meet.
So
selling chicken rolls in pubs, wearing a short skirt with a sash that said hot chick. I did every single crazy job you can imagine. And then I eventually got my first job, a cadetship in radio, which was wonderful. But again, that that taught me you've really got to struggle. You know, things aren't handed to you on a platter, except for Chico rolls, maybe.
It's interesting as you talked about the busking. My face lit up because that was one of my earliest memories. My mum used to sell her paintings on the weekend, again to kind of make ends meet at a market. And my thing was like I wanted money, and obviously I wasn't gonna get it, so I'd just go sit in a corner and start singing Jingle Bells. And I'd put a hat, and my voice was terrible. And I only had 3 songs: Jingle Bells, Mary Had a Little Lamb, and something else. And one day I made $50. And
Stop it!
I was like, you're like $50. Like, this
So
is good.
you've busked as well.
I have busked. Yeah.
Have you done it since?
Oh, absolutely not. I've got a terrible voice. People would pay me $50 not to do it these days, so don't.
That is hilarious. I did it one more time towards the end of uni when I just didn't have enough money for the rent because I moved out of home pretty young. I can only play one piano song, Fur Release. I played it over and over again in front of an organ shop in Queen Street Mall in Brisbane. The other job I had actually, which fired my passion for social justice, was labelling chlorine bottles in a factory on the outskirts of Brisbane. I did that every uni holidays and I worked alongside a lot of migrant workers who really had nothing and were working in really toxic, dangerous workplace conditions, you know. So it's interesting to look back on those times, although I am grateful for it because Mum and Dad were always the people who collected vouchers so we would get discounts on everything. I still do that to this day. My husband grew up in Housing Commission, and even though we're very fortunate to live in a lovely area now, we're still pretty frugal because once you've lived through that, you don't want to go back.
It shapes you, doesn't it? Like I had a business partner, one of the ones we merged with, and you know he's at this stage in the business is very well off, right? And I would still see him every day with a homemade sandwich, like your classic white bread sanger. And I was like, man, like, wow. But his context was from South Africa, a similar kind of thing. It shapes you. You can't really shake that when you go through those years and remember those things.
Yeah.
So take me through now in your career, like what was probably the next pivotal moment in your career that really started to shape things for you?
The next pivotal moment in my career was the tremendous opportunity to do a documentary in a developing country with World Vision. I was working at Channel 10 in Sydney. I'd done a lot of radio journalism, all different types, you know, police, courts, politics. I sort of like that hard, gory stuff. I'm a bit of a hard news journo at heart. But then I got the opportunity to do stories on women and girls in Kenya and in Bangladesh, not getting educational opportunities, being the last to be fed in the family. You know, stumbling upon families who were down to their last bowl of rice with 9 children in the middle of nowhere outside of Nairobi. And that was a real eye-opener because even though I'd seen struggle in Australia, it was nothing like struggle in developing countries. Then I did some more documentaries. I did one in India on gendercide where they were killing the female fetuses because they weren't valued as much as the male fetuses.
Wow.
Just really, really horrific inequity. I did a documentary in Papua New Guinea on the dearth of fresh water sources. We actually got chased with machetes on that documentary filming.
No way.
Absolutely. We got lost on the Sepik River for 4 days. Myself, the camera operator, and the audio guy.
So it's just 3 of you?
Just the 3 of us in a longboat with all of our wonderful minders, people from the Worldwide Fund for Nature. We had security guards, ex-police with massive guns. You know, you can imagine 20-something years ago down the Sepik River getting lost. We eventually got to this village and we were woken at 4 o'clock in the morning by gunshots. And they said, quick, the opposing tribe is coming to attack us with machetes. We've got to get out of here. And we went back a different way on the Sepik River to the way we came. I said, why are we going back this way? And our guide, Alphonse, who was a crocodile skin dealer who worked in New York as well, incredible character, said there's a headhunting village this way. It's quicker to get back, but you'll have to lie down because if they see you, they will come and they will kill us all. So it was an incredible experience. I mean, just living through those different cultural experiences, how dangerous it was, and also the challenges and the struggles that other people around the world face every day.
Okay, Tracey.
Crazy times.
There's a lot of things that I need to unpack, but like, I'm gonna backtrack one little bit to those first moments that you're going to these countries, and you talked about there in Kenya. Not ever being exposed to anything of that degree. Like, what did that feel like when you first enter a place like that?
Oh, it's an absolute shock. I mean, with your South African background, you would understand this. We arrived in Johannesburg before we went to Kenya, and to go to shopping centres where people have got AK-47s at the front because it's so dangerous. So the first shock is the danger and how difficult it is for people to live in that kind of environment. Then we went to Nairobi before we went out to the regional areas to film. I said, I'm going to walk to the chemist to get some hay fever tablets. The producer said, oh, don't do that. The last presenter we had who walked out in that park at the back got her earring ripped clean from her ear through the flesh by a bunch of young kids, and the weapon they used was their own faeces in newspaper. They were too poor to have a knife or a gun, but they threw the faeces at her and then pulled one earring out of her ear. I guess that was such a light bulb moment as to how poverty-stricken everybody was. And then, of course, the next epiphanies happened when we went into the rural and regional areas where they faced even worse situations because of drought and because of their large families. It was shocking, but at the same time, it was incredibly uplifting. We travelled with Tommy Emmanuel, the guitarist. So we were going to schools in the middle of nowhere with the red, dusty soil, and he'd play songs and the kids would dance and then they would sing for us. So there was a lot of joy and community as well as the sadness.
And did you get an opportunity to meet many of the individuals there? Was there any things that you can, when you like reflect and think back to individuals that you could share a story about?
Yes, I met the most incredible leader I've ever met in my life in remote Uganda back in 2012. We were filming at a women's refuge 3 hours out of the capital, Kampala. And 3 years prior, this woman had gone to the refuge run by ActionAid, the anti-poverty agency, and told them the most horrific story of domestic violence I've ever heard in my life. The women of ActionAid were so incensed, they stormed into the Ugandan parliament, told the women legislators that story. Believe it or not, at that time, the Ugandan parliament had more women than the Australian parliament. The women legislators stormed out and said, we're not coming back to pass any laws until all of you guys agree to a law against domestic violence, which at that time affected 80% of women in that country. In fact, if you were a man and you didn't beat your wife, you were considered to be less of a man. So this one woman, her name was Jennifer, changed the course of her country's history by getting a law against domestic violence. The people from ActionAid got her out of her dangerous situation, set her up with a home business with a sewing machine with her remaining children, because at that time women weren't allowed to inherit property. They got a house for her. So not only was she helped, she changed the course of her country's history, and that's leadership. And I often reckon if Jennifer can do that from remote and regional Uganda, what can we do in a country like Australia?
Wow, that's really powerful. And what was the impact and the roll-on effect post that? Did you ever get to like check in and see, post those laws being raised, that percentage change or anything like that?
Yeah, we did. The percentages dropped. I believe it dropped to 60% a couple of years later, and hopefully has kept dropping. But those changes were happening at a time when another phenomenon was occurring. We interviewed a lot of male tribal leaders who had their own version of male champions of change. And they were telling us how finally they were listening to women in the village about how girls should be able to inherit property, otherwise they end up in poverty. So it was a real time of change around that sort of 2009 to 2012. And as we see in countries, once that change happens, it continues exponentially. And
what was the changes from yourself when you experienced these things in your career? Like, how did that evolve into you as a person when you're here back in Australia?
Oh boy, it was really hard initially after we came back. One of the World Vision trips I went on to Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world, gets flooded every year. People lose their homes, they lose their lives. The girls have to go into the city to join the sex trade to make money for their families. I mean, it's horrific on so many levels. I came back and friends invited us over for dinner a couple of nights later, and they were talking about how annoyed they were that their fridge had broken down, their fancy new Smeg fridge, and I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something at the wall and say, don't you realise how privileged you are? I spoke to my husband about it that night. He said, look, you've got to get some kind of mental calibration here. People live differently around the world. But for a long time, I was very angry when people didn't appreciate the privilege that they had. Over time, I've moderated that and realised that we can all help each other by joining together globally, and we learn from each other. That's the other thing I've taken away from it. When I did the India trip, it was at a time where there was an awful lot of raping and sexual assault of girls on buses, actually. It had become almost a sport for a lot of the young men over there. It was terrible. They weren't being prosecuted. Mobs were piling on. And the young Indian World Vision woman, Jasmine, taught me so much about, look, the kind of fights that you fight in Australia for feminism and equity, they're very, very different here. You know, we're at a very different level of the spectrum here, and we need to keep communicating and sharing ideas. And that was really great. It taught me to be more of a global thinker.
Wow. It's incredible. It's something that pops into my mind as you share these stories, and I'm sure this is just like the shallow top, and there's so many of these moments where you're going in here. It's something that I learned from my wife, and my wife is a psychologist, clinical psychologist, and what I saw from her is, you know, she would go in and her specialty was young females with eating disorders. And so you'd have, you know, she'd come home, 4 or 5 clients that day, and some really challenging stories. And you can see the kind of the heavy nature that created on her. And, you know, Holly said to me, you know, it's hard to have someone across from you crying without getting a few tears on yourself. You know, this concept, like taking that emotional baggage, it's part of the gig. And so my question to you is, like, was there an emotional toll from this, like, this consistently seeing these different things in your life?
Oh, gosh, there's so much in that question, and I really feel for your wife, because that is such an incredible job, but such a difficult one because of the vicarious trauma, which I only learnt about years after doing those documentaries, and I'm quite sure in retrospect it's connected. When I did probably 18 months of work as an investigative journalist on the Me Too movement, we did the Don Burke story, the Craig McLaughlin story. I put out a tweet asking for stories, expecting about 12. I ended up getting almost 2,000.
Wow.
All of a sudden, I experienced a major depressive disorder brought on by vicarious trauma. And I do wonder whether doing those documentaries all those years ago and then doing those stories with Me Too, it just tipped me over the edge. And that was partly naivety, partly lack of experience with doing a lot of these stories in a short period of time. I didn't have debriefing like your wife probably has, formalised debriefing with other clinical psychologists and a team and all that stuff. I've got friends who are social workers, they have debriefing.
That's actually really interesting. Do you know what else is interesting? The Eat with Purpose cookbook. It's part of my mission to raise $1 million for charity. This podcast is a part of that goal, and what you can do is like, comment, share, and leave us a review. Let's get back to the guest.
I've learned a lot about, yes, I can do stories like that, but I need to be more robust about putting up some armour, because vicarious trauma is real. It's very similar to PTSD.
You know, it's interesting as you share that too, and I know this is a bit of a leap, so work with me here. Is, you know, the trauma part is not quite the same as what I'm about to share, but there's concept around people in, you know, entrepreneurship and business and creating business. And like what I hear when I hear those stories is like creating that the third space that, you know, post, you know, finishing on what your side, one of those incredible trips to go there directly to a dinner with friends is quite a challenge. Like you need to have something, a process which can kind of get you back into the real world. And that's, you know, something as people kind of grind with businesses as well. Like, you know, having a day filled with firefighting and then coming home and then immediately thinking you're going to switch off and just watch Netflix and be happy, or have a conversation with your wife or husband. It's very challenging. You need to have something that kind of a way in which you can bring yourself into, I guess, being present in the new space you are. And I think that's really a really interesting insight that I hear you share through that story.
I love that. Have you seen Dr. Adam Fraser's TED Talk about the third space?
No, but someone raised it with me the other day. Tell me more.
It's amazing. I shared it with my husband many years ago because he's a television camera operator. He deals with a lot of conflict, especially out the front of courts and at crime scenes in the middle of the night. And I said, look, just listen to classical music in your car on the way home. Do something to find that space so you don't bring that angst into the household. And he did. It worked a treat. Since that time, I've taken that concept into my training. I do a lot of media and presentation training for corporates. And people still fear public speaking more than death, or media interviews, still to this day. And there's neuroscience behind that. It's socially anthropological.
Yes.
There's all of that. You know, we know why we fear it. We fear the audience judging us. The opposing tribe is coming to attack us. And as part of my training, I teach people to find their third space for presenters every time before they go and do an interview or get up on stage, because otherwise it can be a really harrowing and terrifying experience.
And I'm looking here. I'll bring this up to the camera. I'm looking
Shameless
here.
plug. Thank you, Frank.
Here. I'm looking here at your new book, Man-Made. And so I guess my first question is, why this book? Why was it this one that was your next logical book to write?
Everybody thought I was crazy. My friends, my colleagues, my family, when I said 8 years ago, I want to write a book about artificial intelligence because I'm not a technology journalist. I mean, our son for years when he was little called the computer the bloody computer because he thought that's what it was called because I'd scream at it the whole time, that bloody computer's not working. I'm really not technologically adept. But I was very interested in seeing how the workplace was changing and how our lives were changing with the chatbots around us. My son, when he was 11, came to me and said, "Mum, I want a robot slave." I said, "Darling, what are you talking about?" Anyway, in a moment of appalling parenting, my husband and I agreed to let the kids watch South Park in the morning, the adult cartoon series, so we could sleep in for an extra half hour. And Cartman, a very naughty boy in one episode, was ordering around his Amazon Alexa like he was some kind of colonial master. I had this epiphany that all of this stuff I'd done on equity and social justice and human rights could be brought down by what's happening in technology, because a lot of that bias of the past is being built into these chatbots of the future. For example, every home chatbot is deliberately designed with a female voice because we're used to the female being the one who runs the household and the male being the one who runs the workplace. If you listen to most of the chatbots in the business and finance sector, they have male voices because they're viewed as being more authoritative and credible. And that started a long journey of going right down the rabbit hole of a lot of crazy AI devices.
And what did you learn?
I learned some really, really awful things. The one that shocks people the most when I give speeches on this is about the racist soap dispenser. I know. Who would have thought? A sentence I never thought I'd be saying.
I'm just imagining the trailer here for the big podcast, the racist soap dispenser. Sorry, keep going.
That's right. Boom, boom. Back in 2016, a Nigerian tech worker tried to use a soap dispenser at a Marriott hotel. It didn't work for his hands, but it worked for the hands of his white colleague. Now, how on earth does that happen? Well, we think about big tech as big, and they have profit margins larger than nation states. But when they're making devices, it's only 3 or 4 people testing them. And there's no such thing as inclusive design or diversity or inclusion in the teams. So basically 3 or 4 young white guys from Silicon Valley tested it out and thought, this is great, we'll send it around the world. Now, that's annoying when it's a soap dispenser, but that same AI light sensor technology is used in self-driving cars, which in testing are coming up to pedestrian crossings and not stopping for people if they have black or brown skin. They simply don't recognise them as human. And that is a huge problem when it comes to equity. We're seeing a similar thing actually at the moment on the border of the US and Mexico, where people are trying to emigrate and move up north. They're using facial recognition and voice recognition technology, which is phenomenal, but it's been tested predominantly on white Americans, so it doesn't recognise them and they're being rejected.
Right. There's a lot here.
There's a lot here.
And I want to actually take a step back. Like, as you were starting this, because the first thing I noticed there was you said, I learned a lot of awful things. That was the kind of the first thing. And so my question, I guess, is when you started the outset of creating the book, was it with that in mind that there is going to be these deep bad things, or was it more like an open discovery and let me just see what I find? Like, what did that look like to start the shape of the book?
That's such an interesting question because we all come at projects from our own unconscious bias. And when I look back at my book, I can see my own biases coming through. For example, I care not for sport, but I don't have And that's why I don't have a sporting chapter in there. But there's a lot of bias in the technology used in sports training. So I've missed a few areas in my book. I've covered most areas, particularly when it comes to transport and defence and the workplace and the history of AI. And if you go for a job, for example, they'll throw out your CV if you're over 50 or a person with a disability, because that's the way the algorithm views the workplace as predominantly an able-bodied male thing from the 1950s, like Don Draper in Mad Men. So yes, I came at it with my own unconscious biases, but I worked with a researcher and we were both able to step back and say, okay, is this robust or is this just the way that we're viewing it? And we threw out a few examples, but we kept the majority of them. And one of the examples that still shocks me is something called the Compass software in the US. Back in 2016, they revealed that it was incarcerating people of colour at twice the rate of white people, and yet in this year, 2024, it's now used in every state in the US, and in fact, judges are using artificial intelligence to decide upon length of sentencing.
Wow.
And this racism and bigotry is deeply embedded in it.
It's really interesting, right? Like, so again, like as I'm hearing this, because I've only recently heard of a story where there's almost like the reverse of this. I'm curious to know if you've heard about it, which is, people asking, for example, ChatGPT image creator, show me, what was it? I think it was like, show me images of Jesus and the apostles. And all the images were of like Asian descent or this or that. And it was like, and a complete misrepresentation in the other way to try and, I guess, sandwich in unbiased and unbigotry, but then it creates like a distortion of history. So it's curious, like, so my brain goes, is it that in certain things this is baked in where it comes to like what you've talked about, defense and like criminal justice and all that, and then in the, I guess the fluffier, here's imagery, it's all the nice stuff. Like, have you uncovered any of these things?
I love that you've brought this up because I find this fascinating. Do you play with ChatGPT and the image generators?
I have a bit, yes, yeah.
Oh, look, it's tremendous technology. Generative AI is the fourth industrial revolution. We are living through it right now. The ground is shifting under our feet. It can save us so much time and energy and money in the workplace and in our interactions. It can help people who are neurodiverse. I've got a friend with ADHD. She loves ChatGPT because it summarises large bits of text. But what's happened now is that the tech companies are desperately trying to get rid of this bias from the past, but they're doing it in a ham-fisted way. The example you brought up was, I think it was Google's Gemini.
Yep, that's it, yeah.
Its chatbot.
Yeah.
And it basically is changing history.
Yes.
By putting people of colour in historical circumstances where they weren't there. And as a journalist, I think you can't change history. History is history. This is what happened. And at a time of misinformation and disinformation, you can't be going around massaging that. So they're doing it the wrong way. The way they should be doing it is going through their data sets, for example, because usually they're using cheap or free data sets scraped off something like Twitter, now known as X, or Grok, the terrible X chatbot, where there's terrible racist, sexist kind of interactions all the time, just not really good civil society communication, basically, and they're using that to train the chatbots. If they got cleaner data sets with more diversity. In fact, they're talking about creating synthetic data sets with greater diversity. Then you get a good outcome with the kind of images you want that suit today's society and our morals and our mores without changing history.
Yeah, because that's the interesting thing is like sometimes when you hear these things, it sounds very scary and you're like, who is doing this? And sometimes it's not necessarily that someone is purposely doing it. It's just the data is the inherently challenging piece that's showcasing.
Yeah, it's a great point because inevitably data is historical and society moves on. As the great Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So when you're taking data from the past and not cleaning it up and it's a dirty data set, inevitably every doctor will be a male and every nurse will be a female in the story that ChatGPT writes. The other thing that I'm finding really interesting at the moment is the image generators. We use Midjourney to create the cover of the book.
Nice.
And for those of you who haven't used any of the image generators, just put in 12 words and it comes up with a so-called unique image scraped from billions of images around the world, most of them covered by copyright. That's another conversation for another time. But it's phenomenal technology. The problem is that because there's been so many sexualised images, predominantly of women and girls historically on the internet, which really was basically almost all pornography when it started, women are putting in photos and saying, please create for me a professional LinkedIn image, and it's coming back with an image of them with their boobs out and all of their skin perfect and their hair all glossy. Sometimes it's changing their races. An Asian American woman put it in and said, I want a professional shot. It changed her eyes to blue and her skin to white.
Right.
So it's changing people's races as well.
And yeah, it's interesting. I guess it's you've come at it at the right time. You know, you mentioned, you said you kind of started the journey 8 years ago. It's interesting to see how perfectly timed a book coming out in 2023 about this topic is, given that's really last year felt like the pivotal year where people have now realised, okay, things are going to be fundamentally different. Let me take a more macro view around the concept of how you see it changing the field that you've worked in. Like, how do you see the information world, whether it be media outlets, journalism? How do you see that shifting, or have you seen the shift with the tools that are there today?
There is a tabloid newspaper, the biggest selling one in Europe, based in Germany, that's outsourced almost all of its mid to low level roles to artificial intelligence.
Wow.
The only humans they've retained are the editorial writers, because they've got to express an opinion and it's politics, the editor-in-chief, and a few other overseeing roles. But the rest of it is totally automated. So we're going to see huge job losses because AI is phenomenal at maths and patterns. And writing a news story is really structured. It's almost mathematical, which is why I like that kind of writing. But it also opens it up to automation like every other industry. The other problem is the misinformation and disinformation in a year where we're going to have a US election. We've got a lot of elections in Australia this year and next year as well. People are going down the rabbit holes of their own bigotry on social media and have for 10 or 15 years. That's only going to worsen. In recent weeks, Meta has said they're going to expand their watermarking on images, which is great, to articulate this was created by AI, and that's terrific. What we need now is for more countries to adopt the European Union's AI Act as a template. Otherwise, we're just going to see more polarisation of opinion, the disintegration of democracy, and the rise of more strongmen leaders like Donald Trump, like Bolsonaro in Brazil. It really is, it's a scary time in history.
It's and this might be my view of the world. It's interesting when I hear the strongmen leaders, and maybe I'm not taking a political view because I tend to not pay attention too much, and that's probably the wrong thing to do. But I just find sometimes
probably good for your mental health.
Yeah, it's like a mental well-being. Like during the time of building my business, in the early years, you look at the news because there's something to talk, and then I realised there's too much of this kind of negative information that's coming in, and it's not helping me from a business standpoint, and so I kind of, I guess, close my eyes. Not necessarily the right sense, but anyway. But what I've noticed in from a business sense, so I'm part of CEO groups. I've got a lot of, I do a lot of mentoring. I've definitely noticed a shift, and in our business, Real Base, there's probably about 60% females in the business, and not because the CEO went, I got to fill a quota. It was just more like who is the best talent and these are the right talent for the roles. So I've noticed a huge shift and I've only been doing it for 10 years. There are a lot of incredible CEO, female founders, CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. When you talk about that strong men in leadership, is it both business and the politics way you think about it?
You're absolutely right. Women have made tremendous strides into leadership roles in the corporate sector. I reckon mainly in the past 5 to 10 years. We saw huge waves of women come into the workforce in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, and now we're seeing that second level into more powerful roles. I'm talking about political leaders here in relation to the journalist piece because, I hate to say this, my mum was a real estate agent, but journalists historically are viewed as really like used car salespeople when it comes to trustworthiness, and we're even lower these days. So when you've got misinformation and disinformation, people believe propaganda on social media, and there is a link between that now and propaganda we saw that started the Second World War. So when there's so much misinformation, it can be really, really scary for society. With regards to gender splits in leadership, one of the reasons I wrote the book was all I saw in the tech sector, and particularly artificial intelligence globally, were male leaders. There are still very few female leaders there, which is an historical anomaly, because if you look back to the 1950s, more women worked in computing than men.
That's interesting.
So this idea of the IT guy is a very new phenomenon created when a lot of money came into the sector in the 1980s.
That is really interesting, because that I talked about the split of our business in totality. In the coding and software engineering space, we had a team of 50 engineers, maybe 5. And not for the lack of try. What happened was, when we got a recruiter, and he'd be like, this is literally verbatim, hey, I've got this amazing female in tech. Just letting you know, she won't bother doing an interview currently. She wants 180 grand. She's already got 4 offers. Because it was like the golden goose. Do you know? It's like there was the golden goose, and it was just like, she doesn't need to. And I've presented her to 5 different companies. They all asked, like, would you like to place her? I'm like, wow. It's the pool of women in that space is just very small. So I'm curious to know why. I mean, I don't think we'll be able to answer, and will that shift? But yeah, it is really interesting as you define it down to that bucket. Let me do a shift. You've worked with a number of different charities, and this is close to my heart given the mission that I'm on. Firstly, I want to start from how does it feel to work with those people that have such a mission-driven cause?
Oh, it's the best thing you can do in your life, because the greatest secret of all is that helping people is good for them, but it's just as good for you. It fills your cup, it's good for your mental health, makes your heart swell. A lot of things that happened during the pandemic were great. People joined together in communities. A lot of things were terrible as well. When you work to help others, it restores your faith that humans are good. For example, during the pandemic, my husband and I, we'd take our kids out too, were delivering meals through a local organisation called One Meal. They're fantastic. So we'd pile up the back of my husband's van and go door to door, and we met the loveliest people who, similar to people in the area where I grew up, had fallen on hard times because of the pandemic, lost their jobs, had an injury, been survivors, victims of domestic violence, all different sorts of stories, So volunteering and working with charities, you meet the best people.
100%. And we had a guy called Daniel Flynn on from the organisation Thank You, if you've seen in Woolworths and Coles.
So good.
It's so good. And he said something to me which really hit me. He talked about when you have these people work in these organisations and come work with you, he goes, they often deliver their life's best work. Because not only are they now just doing the thing they're passionate about, whether it be design or marketing, but they're now doing it for a thing which is far greater than them and far greater than just corporate profits. It's like when we do, when I deliver this amazing design, or he was talking about a cool story, which was like a person creating a scent for your deodorant, and the person said, "This is my life's best work," because it's like I know if I deliver the best deodorant, the impact that this has in totality of the earth is great. And it brings me to because you mentioned doing this stuff with World Vision. Have you seen different leaders in these organisations that have made an impact on you?
Oh yes, my favourite speaker of all time is not a globally famous person. It's Dr. Tim Costello, who was the CEO of World Vision for many, many years. He's an outspoken advocate about anti-gambling reform. He's a huge social justice advocate. He's such an interesting man because he's the brother of Peter Costello. And I said to him over lunch one day, gosh, how is it that you've ended up being this lefty social justice guy and Peter's ended up being Liberal Party guy for his whole life and really economic rationalist kind of philosophy. And he puts it down to when they were growing up, they'd go on holiday at different uncles' houses.
Wow.
And one uncle was left-wing and the other uncle was right-wing, and that's how they got their politics.
Wow.
So I found him really interesting to talk to, a great speaker, but also, he's quite a bit older now, someone who's spent his whole life trying to change things, travelling around the world, understanding issues, battling, I'm sure, vicarious trauma himself, but he's so influential. He gets up on stage and there is no one else in the room. And I think that's because he was a Baptist minister. You know, when Barack Obama became president, everyone was like, how is he such a good speaker? Speaking in Baptist churches. So Tim Costello's got that same thing. And I love meeting charismatic people like that who are making real change, but who understand the power of influence, because it's hard to get people to change.
And is that part of the thing that you're doing with the media training, like helping people understand that power of influence through the talking?
Yes and no. The first thing I do with people is explain to them how the media works, show them how the sausage is made. Because I think it's really unfair that people who've never had a media interview are all of a sudden expected to get up there on the Today Show or to be faced with a massive big camera and be articulate and speak in grabs and understand. You know, I just don't think it's fair. I think everyone needs media training because everyone's going to be expected to be interviewed these days.
Yes.
We're ending up like America. We follow that path traditionally. So I think it's a fair thing for people to be taught the nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
And then I move on to the power of influence. You know, what's in it for the audience? How can this change their lives? How does this help them feel good, look good, make more time, make more money, save time, make money? You know, your story will resonate if you have the 3 H's, heart, health and hip pocket, because they're the things that motivate people. And that's probably something that you've learnt during your business journey as well. These are the universal motivators.
I have, but I want to drill in because this is really interesting. You know, a lot of the audience listening today are people looking to start their business or in that journey and looking for, I guess, what are the 1%ers to help them. And you know, we're in the content world right now. It's the attention economy. How do I get attention and keep it? And I like this angle. So talk to me more. Like, what were the 3 H's? And let's go a little bit deep on those, you know, for that person in the audience who's like, how can I utilize this to, you know, better market my business?
Excellent. I love talking about this. My mum was a phenomenal real estate agent back in the day, and she taught me so much about selling and marketing. She always used to say, I'm not selling houses, I'm connecting the right person who's selling with the right person for this house.
Beautiful.
And it was all about relationship management. She taught me that at a very young age. With the 3 H's, storytelling changes hearts and minds. You can talk about data and statistics until you're blue in the face. That is not going to influence people, and in fact, it's going to make them cling to their already deeply held beliefs. But if you tell them one story, one moving story that makes them sad, that makes them happy, that makes them angry, that connects with them on a heart level, not a head level, that's what gets them over the line. The second one is health. We all want to know how to be healthier, whether it's mentally or physically. The third one is hip pocket. We all want to know how to save or make money. That's a little bit of a no-brainer. And if you can do some storytelling based around those 3 things, that is priceless.
And even and I guess that this is where you say, if you can, for the 3 things, I'm thinking about those businesses. Is it like in a single content piece, like how do we bring that story? How do we then connect it to something that's healthy and then how to make it around money? You're saying that content delivery will have like a better impact from a return on investment kind of piece? Exactly.
And then if you want to even get more complicated, you can layer over top of that the problem solution narrative. Tell people what problem they have or ask them, and then articulate it really clearly and then provide the solution. It's really simple communication theory, question and answer. The other communication theory I train in is the rule of 3s. The human brain remembers things in 3s, and you're more likely to be able to share information or knowledge or storytelling in 3s. The audience will resonate more deeply with the audience and last in their brains for longer. The other thing which I used in my book, yes, it's about technology, it's about social justice, it's about some gnarly stuff. It's funny. I worked really hard to put humour in there. Very boring breaking down comedy. But if you make people laugh, you're more likely to influence them, because who doesn't want to laugh?
As you were sharing that, it's really interesting. We only did a guest 2-3 weeks ago, a guy called Luke Anir from Safety Culture. And I was seeing this business, so Safety Culture in its from an outsider's perspective is a checklist, right? And you think about, you know, what an unsexy business, right? In theory, checklist. And then you hear Luke connect the why. And Luke talks about, and it was a tragic story, but he talks about a daycare that they'd gone for a trip in a school bus, a small little bus, and had forgotten the one kid in there. And that kid passed away. And then you hear Luke connect that story and how if they had the checklist, which is a safety checklist, how that, you know, his passion is to make sure that there is never that one kid ever again. And then and so on and so on and so on. All these stories with these deep, terrible impact that it has when a business doesn't have the right checklist. And so I hear you as you share that, and I connect, and because my question to him was like, you know, how do we get all these people inspired by this product? And I can really see that through line from what you're talking about. Although an absolutely devastating story is like that through line to, I guess, people give that the why, and not only from the audience but from your internal perspective. So it's really interesting to hear.
That is such a moving story and really wise, because it touches on two other motivators, safety and security, and particularly around people's children. Everyone wants to know how to keep their family safe. That is a universal motivator. Wow. Incredible.
Sorry to bring down the...
No, you've totally nailed it. And look, I'm sure you know a lot more about this than me, right? Because you have got this incredible business, but I find it fascinating what gets people over the line, whether it's to support a charity or to buy a product. And what I've learned about influence, I learned mostly from working with charities because, as you know, they're selling goodwill.
Yeah.
It's an intangible. It's one of the hardest things to sell. It's one of the most satisfying things for the person who buys it, who donates, but they're some of the best marketers you can ever meet.
Yes, 100%. And it's because they have to have a continual, you for a lot of those businesses, not the whole job, but the money, the way in which you can deliver is through getting money. So it's a continual cycle of asking for. And so you kind of have to get, I guess, creative in your narrative to ensure that you can have that continual funnel of cash coming through.
And that's where we get really gnarly and drill down on the 7 deadly sins, which are also motivators. Why do we keep buying fast food as members of society when we know that it's not good for us? We are gluttonous. Why do we get sucked into frauds and scams? Because we're greedy. Why is it that we are influenced to give money for charity? Part of that is ego and status. We want to look good to our neighbours. We want to look like a good citizen. I know this because I worked with a lot of organisations like the Climate Council when we started talking about climate change. And they were saying, gosh, no one's recycling. And then they had a wonderful campaign that encouraged people to do it, because if you're recycling out the front, you look good to your neighbour and to your community, you're obviously a good citizen.
It's always interesting to hear that good connection. Like there's the psychological kind of manipulation you can do through marketing, but you hear it for good, you're like, okay, good. I'm glad you did that.
Yeah, because, yes, it's great to make money, but you can use it for good too.
My last question for you, Tracey. You've had an incredible journey, and there's so many different amazing moments here in your story. But I'd love to kind of boil it down. What is the one thing, as you reflect, you're most proud of?
Oh, look, definitely the work in developing countries. That's the highlight of my career. But personally, it was, and this sounds a little, I don't know, some women might hear this and think, oh, I don't like that. But it was actually having children. I started in the workplace at a time when I was the only woman in the newsroom, and I've always been very career driven. I never thought I wanted to have children until my early 30s, and then all of a sudden the biological clock was deafening. Fortunately, I met my husband at that time. We fell in love, went through years and years of IVF in order to have children. And that journey of raising them and seeing them become adults, which they are now, has been the greatest gift of my life. And being able to combine that with the career, yes, that's tough, but it's also been the greatest joy.
I love that. And I'm going to add one more question because I'm gluttonous. What's the through line from your context that's the thing you want to impart on your kids?
To give back, to find a job that you love, because if you work within an area of passion, it's not work. You enjoy every day. You work hard, but it makes you happy and it becomes your life's work. But when you make that great success, when you earn that money, when you have that lovely house and beautiful car, then give back. Don't just do it for yourself. It's the best thing you can do to give back to society.
Amazing. Tracey, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate having you on.
Thank you.